From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal opinion page. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. Thanks very much for listening. Please do sign up and subscribe if you're not already subscribing at Apple Podcasts or wherever else you do your listening. This week, we're taking a little bit of a break from the hurly-burly of American politics and what's happening in the US economy. And we're going to look at the big event in the world that is happening in Rome, or to be precise, in Vatican City, in Europe. That, of course, is the election of the next Pope, the successor to Pope Francis, who died last month, and the 266th successor to St. Peter, who died 2,000 years ago. As we know, the conclave, which opens on Wednesday, we're recording this on Tuesday around lunchtime, but the successor to St. Peter will be elected by the conclave that starts meeting on Wednesday, May the 7th. As you know, many of those of you will have seen this before, and I speak as a Catholic myself, so those of us Catholics who are watching will be watching with great interest. So the conclave opens, the Cardinals process to the Sistine Chapel, where they pray, they meet. The cry of extra omnes goes out from the attendants. The doors are locked, and inside the conclave, at least for the first morning and for each session, the cardinals meet in secret and begin voting. We've no idea how long this process will take. 2013, when Pope Francis was elected, there were 5 ballots, which were held over 2 days. Of course, again, as you'll all know, whenever a candidate has reached two-thirds majority, has achieved a two-thirds majority of the voting cardinals, that cardinal is declared. Doesn't have to be a cardinal, I should say. Technically, of course, as we know, the only qualification to be elected is to be a baptized Catholic and be male, but we can pretty well assume that it's going to be one of those 133 voting cardinals. When one has a two-thirds majority, we get the famous white smoke from the temporary chimney of the Sistine Chapel. A few moments later, the new Pope comes out to the announcement of Habemus Papam on the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square, and we learn the identity of the man for the first time in a little bit of Latin, and then we're introduced to him. So all that will happen at some point in the next few days. We don't know how long. We don't know how long this conclave will be, but we'll be watching it very closely. What we're going to talk about today, we're not going to try to identify who will be the next pope. That, frankly, is a game that's played all around the world around about now. And having watched quite a few conclaves, I can say with some confidence that the speculations are almost always wrong. So while there are many candidates, and you can read about them in the Wall Street Journal, you can read about them everywhere else and see the discussion about them elsewhere, we're not going to talk about the candidates who might win, who might lose, because, frankly, we don't know. And secondly, there are actually more interesting things to talk about in terms of where the Catholic Church is going. The Pope, of course, is the leader of 1 billion Catholics, spiritual leader to some extent for many Christians, the 2 billion Christians as well, and plays, even in a more secular age than we've had over the last couple of millennia, Pope still plays an enormously important role, both for Catholics, obviously, Christians more broadly, but also, as we saw with John Paul II, or to some extent with Pope Francis, can play a significant role in the lives of people around the world beyond the spiritual. So we're going to look at what the kind of debates are that are likely to be going on among the cardinals, what the views are of the legacy of Pope Francis, as I say, who just died after a 13-year papacy, what kind of a pope the cardinals may be looking for, what are the concerns that they have about maybe the church, about its doctrine, about the teaching of its doctrine, the following of its doctrine, about the church's role in the world, what the different and divergent views of the 133 voting cardinals may be. And to do that this week, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by a genuine expert on this topic who's covered many of these conclaves, a genuine expert on the papacy and the Catholic Church, one of our foremost lay experts on the church. And that's George Weigel, a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and many, many other publications, written several books, and as I say, is a genuine expert and is in Rome right now watching all the proceedings. And I'm delighted to say that George joins me now. George Weigel, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Thank you, Gerry. Good to be with you again.
So I gave that introduction, and what I said in the introduction, George, as you heard, was we're not going to talk about the candidates, the identity of the candidates. I mean, I'm sure some names will crop up in the course of the conversation as we talk about the topics and the issues that will be on the cardinals' minds as they vote over the next few days. But we're going to talk instead about those topics, about those issues, about how the changing views of and the changing and diverse views of the role of the church. Let's start, if we may, though, George, since you're there, and I said before, you've seen many of these conclaves unfold. Just paint a little picture for us, if you would, of what we can expect. As I said at the beginning, we're recording this Tuesday evening, your time in Rome. The conclave starts Wednesday. Just paint the picture of the procedural for us, if you would, about what happens tomorrow, what happens Wednesday, and what we can expect over the coming hours and days.
It's been beautiful weather for 2 weeks here in Rome, lovely late spring weather, which has, I think, helped everybody's frame of mind. As we're recording this on Tuesday evening Rome time, the Cardinals are moving into the Vatican guest house, the Domus Sanctae Martyr, where they will be living during the conclave. They have to be in by tomorrow morning, but most of them are coming in tonight. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock local time, there will be celebrated in St. Peter's Basilica what is called the Mass for the election of the Roman Pontiff. Then at 4:30 tomorrow afternoon, the 133 cardinal electors will process from the Pauline Chapel in the Apostolic Palace into the Sistine Chapel, where each one of them, one by one, will swear an oath of confidentiality about the proceedings. They'll hear something of a sermon, and then the Papal Master of Ceremonies will say extra omnes, which is a polite Latin way of saying everybody get out of here. And then they will take the first vote. That will almost certainly not be decisive. So I would expect that about 7:30 or 8 p.m. here tomorrow night, we'll get the first black smoke out of that famous chimney on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. In the following days, there will be 2 voting periods in the morning and the afternoon. There are 2 ballots in each voting period. After a successful ballot, meaning a 2/3 majority has agreed on a candidate, white smoke will emerge from that chimney. After 2 unsuccessful ballots in a row, black smoke will emerge. As you indicated in your introduction, after the white smoke emerges, I would say it'll probably be about an hour before the new Pope comes out on the central loggia of St. Peter's Basilica to be introduced to the Church and the world. No one knows when that's going to be, so it's really a matter of waiting until a decision is reached. A 2/3 majority, as you know, Gerry, from your study of politics, is not an easy thing to achieve. It's not a simple majority, it's a supermajority. So this could take a while. It might be longer than the previous 2 conclaves. We'll just have to wait and see.
Thanks for that. That's a very, very nice and colourful painting of the scene for us, George. Tell us what's been going on. And as they go into the conclave on Wednesday, there's obviously been a lot of discussions. Many of the cardinals have been in Rome. Most of them were in Rome for Pope Francis's funeral 10 days ago. They've doubtless been having conversations. How many of them have made up their minds already, do you think? I mean, what's the decision-making process as they go into the conclave? I hate to use sort of crude kind of political terms, but are there kind of pacts going on? Is there campaigning going on? What's the campaign process, if you like, that's been happening over the last 10 days or so?
Well, there have been formal meetings of cardinals called general congregations every day since the Pope's funeral. Those conversations or those general congregations include not only the voting cardinals, but more than 100 cardinals who will not be voting because they're over 80 years old. And in those general congregations, cardinals will get up and say what they think needs to be said about the state of the Church, what's necessary in a new pope. During those general congregations, the cardinals received a very stringent, I would say, financial report. The Vatican is not in good shape financially. That certainly got people's attention. But in addition to those general congregations, there are lunches, dinners, small group conversations going on all over the city. I wouldn't call it so much a process of campaigning, but really of getting to know each other. This is the most diverse electorate in papal history. Pope Francis, I have to say, made a very serious error by not bringing these men together on a regular basis so that they could get to know each other. In fact, at the beginning of the general congregations, one new cardinal got up and said to the dean of the College of Cardinals, who was presiding over this, "Have you ever heard of name tags?" You know? He said, "Look, I hear somebody. I think they're very interesting. I'd like to meet them. I don't know their name." So 2 days later, they had name tags.
Like a gathering of a sort of sales executives convention in sort of Illinois or something. They're wandering around with their name tag saying, "Hi, I'm Jean Baptiste," or whatever.
But this is part of the human texture of this, Gerry. I think it's a mistake to think of these deliberations and conversations on the model of, the Oxford Union or the Lincoln-Douglas debates or whatever. Men are assessing each other as personalities. There's ideas certainly come into that. There are different views among them of how to assess the pontificate of Pope Francis, and particularly his mode of governance, which, despite a great deal of media confusion, if I may say, was autocratic. And there's been a fair amount of quiet but very real criticism of that. I think a lot of these men want a more consultative way of governing the church and a less idiosyncratic, if I may put it that way, mode of governance. So there are a lot of moving parts in these conversations. And in the course of them, men form judgments about other men, including the judgment that almost never gets talked about, but is actually part of the human texture of this. And that is, can I work with this man? Mm-hmm. I mean, most of these guys are running local churches, some of them small, some of them enormous, and they want somebody they can work with, that they can talk to, that they feel they can be heard by. And then finally, I would say, and I think this is a genuine part of the human texture, when you walk into that Sistine Chapel and you swear an oath on the Book of the Gospels while looking at Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment and Christ returning in glory, and he does not have a happy face on, you're taking your soul in your hands. And that's part of the unknown and unknowable dimension of all of this, is what kind of spiritual wrestling are these cardinal electors going through?
Before we get on to the substantive questions that they've been asking each other and probing and trying to explore with their cardinal colleagues, one final procedural point, George. How much do we learn about these deliberations, either the pre-deliberations or, you talk the congregations you've talked about, or more importantly from the conclave itself? I've read lots of books and lots of reporting. I was in Rome after the death of John Paul II and the election of Pope Benedict. Remember, the Italian press has all these stories every day about so-and-so. And then you read books subsequently, and I've read many of them which say, on the first ballot in 1978, Carol Vortia got whatever, and so some of them even have the numbers that each candidate gets. I think it's pretty well widely known, by the way, correct me if I'm wrong, George, but Jorge Bergoglio became second, I think, in the 2005, that's what widely reported in the 2005 conclave that elected Benedict. How much is reliable? I mean, of course, they're sworn to secrecy. Conclave, we know, means with a key, and sworn to secrecy on their souls. But obviously we talk. How much do we learn about the deliberations that go on, and how accurate is that reporting that we get about how the balloting went and whether somebody was ahead and then fell back because it wasn't clear they were going to get 2/3? How reliable is all of that stuff?
I think it's more reliable over time, Gerry, than immediately. I think over the years, broadly accurate portraits of the contours of the voting emerge. I've got a bunch of these books that you refer to that seem to have a, ballot by ballot numerical count of things. I frankly don't know where any of that material comes from with any degree of reliability. I think the general congregation discussions that have been going on the past 2 weeks have been pretty well accurately reported. Some of the points of contention, some of the concerns that have been raised, not a lot of detail, but I think over time the landscape is clarified of a conclave. But I would urge everyone to take immediate reporting on this with a large grain of salt. And especially, I don't mean to be cruel to my hosts here, but in the Italian press, the line between fact and fiction is quite porous. And I've often said it's not a wall, it's a membrane. And we all know what crosses membranes on occasion. So that needs to be taken very, very cautiously.
Does that also apply? We've heard, again, we're not going to talk about names, but there's been a lot of reporting about names, whether it's the Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, or Cardinal Erdo of Hungary, various names that they're always talked about. And we're going to get onto on the issues in a minute. But again, in your experience, having seen some of these conclaves, you know much more about it than I do, my own, rather dim recollection is that this pre-conclave speculation often turns out to be wildly wrong. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. I mean, in 1978, the Italian press elected a man named Sergio Pignedoli in the weeks before the conclave. I'm not sure he got a vote.
Yeah.
The last time around, in 2013, Italian press had elected Cardinal Scola, the Archbishop of Milan, and while he was certainly, a factor in that conclave, he didn't win. And we'll see what happens. I mean, as we say down below the Mason-Dixon line where I live, even a blind pig finds an acorn every now and then. So they might get it right this time.
The only one I can really recall I do recall Benedict Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, sort of being seen as a kind of a favorite going into 2005. That's right, isn't it? And that was the one time probably I can recall in my lifetime when they seem to have got it broadly right.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think people who actually knew what was going on understood that he was far and away the front runner going in. But I remember after he gave the homily at that Mass for the election of the Roman Pontiff, where he inaugurated a phrase that would become very familiar when he talked about the dangers of a dictatorship of relativism.
Right.
Well, in today's terms, we would say a dictatorship of wokery. Father Richard McBrien, may he rest in peace, of Notre Dame, announced in the Washington Post the following morning that phrase, which he regarded as off-the-wall radical, meant that Ratzinger knew he was not going to be elected and would not be elected, and 6 hours later he was elected.
Right. So, I think nobody knows anything is the general rule that applies. We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with George Weigel, Catholic commentator and author, who's in Rome. We'll have more on the conclave that is going to elect the next pope. We'll have more after the break. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with George Weigel, Catholic commentator and author. We're talking about the conclave soon to open that will elect the next pope. So let's move on to what the cardinals are going to be looking for and what the discussions have been about and will be about in the conclave. First of all, let's start with Francis's legacy. I mean, the first thing to say again is that Francis has, I think the number I'm correct in saying is, I think 80% of the 133 electoral cardinal electors were picked by Francis, were raised to the cardinalate by Francis, which is pretty extraordinary. And again, tell us more about this. It would be a mistake, a grave mistake, to think that means, with that kind of a Francis majority, to resort to ridiculous political terms, that they're going to elect someone like Francis, right?
Well, first of all, Gerry, I think it's important to remember, and this has been remarked on by cardinals in the general congregations. The cardinals are not here to elect the successor of Francis. They're here to elect the successor of Peter. And that is a very different proposition. The cardinals were not here in 2005 to elect the successor of John Paul II. They were here to elect the successor of Peter. So I think a lot of these men are quite aware of that. As to the percentage of the electorate appointed by Pope Francis, well, in 1903, something like 95% of the electorate had been appointed by Pope Leo XIII, who really created the modern papacy. And they elected a man, Pope Pius X, totally different personality, very different cast of mind, who really put the brakes on the reformist currents in Leo XIII's pontificate. So none of that really makes a big difference in terms of predictability. There has been great appreciation expressed across the board for Pope Francis's outreach to the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the poor. I think there's some concern, and it's a legitimate concern, that it's one thing to reach out to the poor, which the church has been doing for 2,000 years. It's another thing to know why people are poor and what you might do about that. Those are two different propositions. I have heard virtually nothing about climate here for the last 2 weeks. And that was a significant part of Francis's public commentary. That just has not been under discussion here. The critical side of this has been on something I mentioned a moment ago, namely mode of governance. This was the most autocratic pontificate in several hundred years. Some years ago, I said to a friend of mine who knows far too much Catholic trivia, I said, he's the most autocratic, Francis. He's the most autocratic pope since Gregory the 16th. And my friend said, no, Gregory the 16th used to listen to his barber.
Yeah, that's you just got to admire that degree of papal historical knowledge there, I think.
But there is genuine concern about that.
Tell us what you mean by his autocratic. I've heard this too. How did it manifest itself? It's a pretty bold statement, that the most autocratic pope. It is, after all, an autocracy, in several hundred years. Give some examples of how he governed.
Well, let's back this up a bit. The papacy is not an autocracy. Toward the end of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI wanted the council to say in its fundamental document, Dogmatic Constitution of the Church, the Pope is accountable to the Lord alone. And the Council's Theological Commission, which had some very conservative people on it, said that's just not true. The Pope is accountable to divine revelation. The Pope is accountable to human reason. The Pope is accountable to the decrees of ecumenical councils. He's accountable to the natural moral law that we can know by reason. And then they said, and other things too numerous to mention. So the Pope is not an autocrat. He is the custodian of a tradition. He's not the master of the tradition. Pope Francis was a Jesuit, as everyone knows, and Jesuit superiors are autocrats. They are the boss. They are the man. And Francis brought that autocratic style of governance into the papacy. He did not consult particularly widely. He called several of these synods of bishops and then in several cases simply ignored what the consensus was that had been registered in those synods and went ahead on his own, most controversially, in this matter of so-called blessings of gay couples. And internally, this is very inside baseball stuff, but
we like to be inside baseball.
The Vatican just did not work very well under Pope Francis. There was an atmosphere, I have to say, not unlike the present atmosphere in Washington, D.C., where if you breathe a word of criticism, you are in big trouble. So that kind of atmosphere, when people are afraid to say, Mr. President, or in this case, Your Holiness, I think we need to look at this a different way, is not conducive to good governance.
And there are examples, aren't there, George, of people who did exactly that and paid the price?
Absolutely. We're not going to get into names here, but one cardinal who will have a vote in this conclave was a senior judicial figure in the church and got cross-wired with Pope Francis, who wanted to reverse a decision that a certain Vatican court had made. And the cardinal in question said, well, you can't do that. And Pope said, of course I can do it. I'm the Pope. And the cardinal said, well, yeah, actually you can. But if you do, it's the end of the rule of law in the church.
Right.
So there's a lot of concern about that. And let's look at, just some of the things I mentioned in your paper a couple of weeks ago. There's been a lot of criticism of the Vatican's China policy, in which, as you know, the Communist Party of China is allowed a significant voice in the nomination of bishops. That, by the way, is another illegal thing. That is a violation of Canon 377.5 of the Code of Canon Law. Those criticisms have simply not been taken seriously. Ditto the silence or relative silence on the persecution of the church in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. Mary O'Grady was writing about this in the paper the other day in a very fine column. So there are many, many, many examples. If you don't like autocratic, then idiosyncratic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the papacy really ought not be only the expression of one man's personality and judgments. As I say, he's the custodian of a tradition, not its master.
So would you go so far as to say then, from what we've just been saying about Francis, about the criticisms of Francis, and about what you said sort of earlier about the conversations that have already been taking place and some of the things that seem to be being said, would you go so far as to say that there's a consensus, or that there's at least a kind of preponderance among the cardinals of a desire to have what they talk about, right? The big phrase, the term is synodality, right? That is a more, if you like, collegial approach to governing the church than the autocratic style. Do you think that's one thing we can pretty much take to the bank, or is it still possible that we might get another kind of martinet in the job?
No, I don't think we're going to get another autocrat. Since no one knows what synodality actually means, the term has never been defined over the past 10 years, and there was a lot of debate these past 2 weeks on what that means. I wouldn't say those are the options, I put quite that starkly. I would say there is a consensus that there should be a return to a more normal, law-governed, stable mode of papal governance. A couple of weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago, Dr. Matt Frank, who works at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, wrote a piece in which he said, "I want a pope I don't have to think about every day." You know?
Some of us want a president like that as well, George.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. And I think there's also a consensus here that the next man should dial it back a little bit in terms of media presence.
Right.
When I got over here, I read a piece somewhere, I can't recall where, that Pope Francis had given 300 interviews in 12 years. Well, this is just overexposure, and it really does diminish the moral authority, I think, of the papacy if the Pope is constantly expressing opinions, and particularly on matters about which he has no particular competence. I think, Cardinals are looking for someone who's going to be a bit more reticent about microphones, if we can put it that way.
Forgive me for dragging the murky, horrible, secular world of politics back into this, but I've got to say, you're painting a picture of a pope, autocratic, little respect for the rule of law, loves the media, says things on the media, talks about things he doesn't really know about, which some listeners may find kind of alarmingly or remarkably similar to the current president of the United States. But anyway, we'll move on from that. So that's a really important, and you've really established this importance of turning away from the autocratic style of France. Let's get into the kind of what might be the kind of doctrinal or ideological, however you want to talk about it, kind of debates that are going on among the cardinals. The media likes, and I'm guilty of exactly the same thing because I've just done exactly the same thing, but the media likes to portray every single debate within the Catholic Church as very simple, black and white, conservative versus liberal, conservative versus progressive, sort of mapping political terminology straight across to the affairs of the church. And I must say, for most of the media, obviously, George, and you know this very well, that maps across as, conservative equals bad, liberal, progressive equals good. Even I know, with my limited knowledge of the way the church works, even as a Catholic, that's simplistic and false. You know much, much better. Tell us what you think, though, the kind of axes of discussion are in this field, that the lines of cleavage among the cardinals in terms of what they want the next pope to be and to do.
Gerry, I think the fundamental question here involves how the Catholic Church or any religious community deals with postmodern culture, which has a view of the human person, plastic, malleable, anything goes. There are no givens in the human condition. Everything can be changed by acts of will, including one's sex. How do you deal with that? Now, the living parts of the world church, whether we're talking about the living parts of the church in North America or the fantastic growth of the church in sub-Saharan Africa, have demonstrated that Catholicism can not only survive but grow when it is quite clear about its doctrinal and moral identity and boundaries. If you look at Western Europe, and particularly the church in Germany, which has conceded vast amounts of ground to this cultural tsunami that has swept over the Western world over the past 5 or 6 decades, it's dying. There is 2% mass attendance on Sunday in major German cities. That strategy of accommodation, of what I have been calling for 23 years now, Catholic light, seems to lead inevitably to Catholic zero. Yeah. I mean, it's not like, pardon me, Coca-Cola. This is a fundamental question. Related to that, and put the matter more theologically, if I may, for just a moment, are there settled and given truths of Catholic faith that the church always has to find, fresh ways to express so that people in a certain cultural context can understand them, but the truths remain constant? Or are we able to correct, if you will, divine revelation or what human reason had taught us for years? This was really the argument at these two synods in 2014 and 2015 over whether Catholics in canonically irregular marriages, divorced and remarried without having the previous marriage declared null. Does the church today know more about the Lord on the permanency of marriage? Does the church today know more than St. Paul about worthiness to receive Holy Communion? Or are those fixed reference points? Now, liberal Protestantism, since the late 18th century, largely influenced by Hegel, I would say, if I can toss in a philosophical name, has basically said there are no fixed reference points. We are in the flow of history. We try to keep the ship pointed downstream, but there are no fixed navigational points. And of course, liberal Protestantism is dead or dying throughout the world. But there are still Catholics who want to try going down that route. Some of them do it for intellectual reasons. They don't believe that these classic understandings are defensible. Some of them do it out of a wonderful sense of compassion, but without perhaps recognizing that sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do for someone is tell them you're living in such a way that you're destroying your life. Try considering something else. As you say, this often gets parsed in the conservative liberal categories, but my old and dear friend, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, when he went to that great city in 1996 or 97, I forget which. And of course, at the first press conference, some guy pops up from the Tribune or the Sun-Times or whatever and says, "Are you a liberal Catholic or a conservative Catholic?" And Cardinal George, who was probably the smartest bishop in the history of the church in the United States, said, "Look, Catholicism is not about left and right. It's about true and false. It's about right and wrong. It's about what makes for noble and worthy living and what makes for degraded and death-dealing living. That's what we're about here." So I think there's a broad recognition of that here, but there is still division on this question of, if I may put it this way, how much ground do you concede to contemporary culture? Or is the church fundamentally in the business, as John Paul II would have insisted, of engaging culture in order to convert it? To give the Western Freedom Project a more solid human and moral foundation, not to confuse freedom with license, not to think of choice as the word that stops all argument about everything. Because obviously the serious question is choose what? Yeah. Choose what? Yeah. I mean, it's the what that gives human choice, either it's nobility or it's degradation.
And not to be too sort of crude or crass about this, but where do you think, and obviously we won't know, we may not even know when we know the identity of the next pope, but where do you think that the church is, or those cardinals, those 133 cardinals, are on this question of how much ground to give way to? I mean, again, in very broad brush terms, you could say that Benedict XVI, it is broadly fair to characterize him as a kind of as a more of a traditionalist, shall we say, very much a theologian. It is broadly fair to characterize Francis as someone maybe who wanted to go a little further towards meeting the kind of the demands and the conditions of the modern world. Where's your sense, again, as these cardinals gather now, of where they are on that question?
Gerry, it's probably of less consequence for the next 50 to 100 years of the church's life where these 133 electors are than where the rest of the church is. And as I indicated a moment ago, if you go around the world church, the living parts of it are those that have embraced Catholicism in full, that are living that joyfully and with compassion. And the dying parts of the world church are those that have conceded so much territory, cultural territory, human territory, to the worlds that we can call political correctness or wokery or Gramscian Marxism or whatever, whatever label you want to put on this. The fundamental question is, who are we as human beings? And are there truths built into the world and into us that observed make for flourishing, happiness, social solidarity? Or is everything up for grabs? Yeah. Is everything up for grabs? And if everything is up for grabs, and neither you nor I recognize something called the truth, by which we can settle our differences if we come into conflict, then you do get Ratzinger's dictatorship of relativism. Coercive state power comes in and imposes something, and that's often wokery.
I don't want to leave this conversation. I think many listeners would think it unfair and wrong to leave this conversation without a very brief visit to the question of kind of the sort of internal management of the church. You've already talked about Francis' style and perhaps the desire to move away from that sort of autocratic style, but we can't have a conversation about the church, unfortunately, in the modern era without talking about the obvious and egregious failures of the hierarchy to deal with the problems that we saw over the last half a century and more of abusive priests who were guilty of sexual abuse, and many of them were covered up or just allowed to remain in place or moved around. The church really handled that badly, and I think there are legitimate criticisms, whatever we think of those, the papacies, there are legitimate criticisms of each of the last three popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis himself, over many of these questions. Is that a topic that's being discussed at all? Is there still a sense there that there is still a bit of a clean-up job needed, or is that sort of thought to be kind of largely in the past?
Well, it certainly shouldn't be thought to be largely in the past, because I think there is a major cleanup job to be done on these issues in Latin America, for example, where they have not been addressed with anywhere near the vigor that has been the case in North America. I think this is probably true in Asia and parts of Africa as well. And I think there is an understanding here that this is immensely damaging to the evangelical mission of the church. If the church cannot demonstrate that it lives by the truths it proclaims, we're in big trouble. I think there really was disappointment with Pope Francis on this. I mean, in some cases, he acted decisively. In others, he didn't act decisively at all. So this remains an open sore. And whoever the next Bishop of Rome is, he is going to have to continue to get to grips with this. I think often in places where it has not yet fully emerged, but is beginning to. And I would say to my friends who are cardinal electors, you have to make sure that whoever you choose is absolutely whistle clean on the management of these problems if they have occurred on his watch in whatever jobs he's been.
Again, we're not going to get into names because, as we've said, it's pointless. And you've already talked about the changing geography of the church, how the dramatic growth in sub-Saharan Africa, obviously the kind of continuing decline. There are some interesting signs, perhaps counter indications that maybe there is a bit of a revival happening in a very small and slow way in Europe and, maybe in the United States too. But the growth has been very much, as you've said, in the global south, as the term is nowadays. John Paul II was the first non-Italian pope for hundreds of years, I think about 400 years. Pope Francis was the first non-European pope for over 1,000 years. Again, without naming names, is that a consideration as the cardinals meet, or do you think it's really about the man, it's really about the faith and the confidence that they place in the man? Is the recognition of the changing geography of the church perhaps going to be reflected in the identity of the next pope?
It's certainly the case, Jerry, that during these last 2 weeks, a number of cardinals from the Third World have emerged as major figures for the future. I think nationality essentially means nothing in this election. Whether Latin Americans and Europeans can wrap their heads around the idea of a black African pope is perhaps a different question. North Americans certainly can. Parts of Europe can. I think some parts of Asia can. But nationality, I think, is gone as a category. And there may be an Italian pope, but anyone who says that means the Italian Restoration. It just doesn't know what they're talking about. So it's a much, much broader field than it ever has been. And as I say, there are men who have emerged over the past 2 weeks from Asia, from Africa, who are going to be heard from for the next 15 to 20 years of Catholic life.
You're there now with all the drama about to unfold. As I recall, as I look at what we think of the numbers, I think Francis was elected after 5 ballots, as I said. I think maybe Benedict after maybe fewer than that, maybe 4. John Paul II after 8. No one knows, so I appreciate the question is speculative. But do you expect that sort of 4, 5, 8 ballots, 2 or 3 days? Or, I mean, one conclave famously lasted for 3 years. I think we can probably say that. Happen. Any sort of sense at all of how long this process may be?
I really don't, Jerry. I mean, I think it's a very fluid situation. I can imagine a scenario in which this is settled, say, on Thursday afternoon, after 4 or 5 ballots. I can imagine another scenario in which it goes into Saturday. So I think it's just absolutely unclear at this stage. And anyone who says that they, have got the answer to your question is probably not been paying a lot of attention to the dynamics over the past 2 weeks.
George Weigel, thank you very much. Well, you are in a great place. I know you'll be watching closely, prayerfully, and wish you all the best. And we look forward to what happens in the next few days. We appreciate very much what you've told us, and we're definitely all better informed as we watch the conclave for your remarks. Thanks very much indeed, George Weigel, for joining Free Expression.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for this episode of Free Expression. And by the time you listen to the next episode, we may well, habemus papam, may indeed have a pope. I suspect we will, but if not, we'll continue to watch with interest. But we'll be back anyway next week with another episode on another topic. And in the meantime, thanks very much for joining us. Have a great week, and look forward to speaking to you then.